Okay, so Java 1, Lesson 6, and today we're going to be talking about if statements. So if statements are like condition statements that they're another name for saying them. So condition statements, if statements, they're basically the same thing. They will only operate if a condition is true. So this is the following is the general format for an if statement. And also assume the letters inside the print statements in all the examples are variables that have a string with their name as their value. So basically, if, for example, in the following example, A, there was a variable named A with a string that was A as the value. So it just makes it easier for me to go through this. But anyways, right. So like I said, the following is the format for an if statement. So if true, and then curly brackets, system.out.println A. So what this means is, like, at first I just programmed it to be true, but in between the parentheses, you can put anything that evaluates to a Boolean. So remember when I talked about Boolean statements earlier in the course? You can put one of those there and then like program it yourself, since it evaluates to a Boolean, and then you can use it for the if statement. So what this says is if the expression in between the parentheses are true, then it executes the thing inside the curly brackets. So, for example, if the if statements evaluated to false, then it would skip this entire block of code and just move on to the next thing after it. Yeah, so like I said, an if statement says that if the argument evaluates to true, then it'll operate the statements inside the brackets. If the argument evaluates to false, then Java skips over the statements inside the brackets and moves on to the next thing after the if statement. Basically just what I said, but it's in word form. If statement example. So, as you see on the left here, you can have this type of expression in between the parentheses. And since this evaluates to Boolean, that's allowed. So if you see here, in parentheses, we put 5 plus 6, so that equals 11. And 11 is equal to 11, which evaluates to true. So since this statement evaluates to true, then we would execute the statements inside the block. And since we do that, if we do a print statement inside the block and have print something out, and since if it evaluates to true, then it prints out 11. Since it evaluates to true, it prints out 11. Sorry if that was a little bit wordy, but anyways. So on the right side, you see here, it's basically the same example, but changing the equals to exclamation point equals. So since 5 plus 6 equals 11, and 11 is actually equal to 11, so that means this expression evaluates to false. And since it evaluates to false, it skips over this block and it outputs nothing. Notes about if statements. If statements go in between the second pair of brackets in like the main program. Make sure to have good formatting. And this is when it's necessary to have good formatting, since now is when we start getting blocks of code. So that means you have to make sure you're formatting the if statement part and the curly brackets part different from the body of it, which is like where you execute stuff. So this is where it's important to have it, since it's easier to read then, and it makes it look nicer. Like I said, the condition can be anything that can evaluate to a Boolean. If you make an error inside an if statement, but it never runs if statement, then the error will never show up. That's because the compiler, it doesn't it doesn't really go into the if statements. It just skims over it to see that everything is correct. But when it's running, it does. If it doesn't run the if statement, then if there's any potential errors inside the if statement, then it doesn't run. So that's why the error won't come up. If it doesn't run, then it doesn't come up, basically. So, and you can put as many statements inside an if statement as you want. And also, you don't have to put the brackets on another line after the if statement. You can just stack them together. Stack them in your statements after the condition statement. But it's not advised for if statements have that contain multiple statements, since it gets messy. And I'll like give an example of it later during the problem section. So another type of if statement. So this type of if statement is called an if-else block. And so the general format is below. So you can see here, if true, curly brackets, system.out.println A, and else, curly brackets, system.out.println B. So how this works is that, so if this condition inside parentheses works, if it values true, then it prints out the statement inside the curly brackets, and then it skips over the else block entirely and moves on to the next thing after it. And then if it evaluates a false, then it automatically goes to else and prints it out, or like evaluates it. So it else acts as a little bit like a default in a sort of way. So yes. And yeah, so basically else operates as a default block. And so if the if statement doesn't evaluate true, then it automatically evaluates, executes else. Yeah, so just gonna read it again. So this is saying that if the condition is true, then it executes the statements inside the first statement and then skips over the else statement when it's done executing the first statement's arguments. If the condition isn't true, then as a default, Java executes the statements inside the else block. After it's done executing the statements inside the else block, then it moves on to the next bit of code. You can't have an else without an if, and an else always goes with the previous if. So that means that, so basically, if you have, it's not necessary to put an else block with an if block, but if you have an else block, you have to have an if block. Otherwise, it's going to come up with an error. And an else always goes with the previous if, which means that if you have an else block and like multiple else blocks and loads of if statements, then the else always goes with the if statement that's directly above it. Example of an if-else block. So basic examples. So over here on the left, you see if true, it prints. So of course it'd print A. And yes, so because it prints A since it's true, so then it skips over the else block. And over here on the right, you can see that since it's false, it skips over the if and goes directly to the else, and it prints out B. Another type of if statement. So general format for an if, else block. And so, yeah, so you can see here that if true, curly brackets, system.out.print, else if, false, system.out.print, else system.out.print. So what this is, it's more complicated than the other two. So what this is if the first statement evaluates to true, then it executes the statements inside and then skips over the else if and else. If the if statement, the first one, evaluates to false, then it moves on to test the next statement. And if that evaluates to true, then it executes that and skips over the else. If the else if is false, then it goes automatically to else and executes that. So else in here always acts as a default. So it always goes as a default. So yeah, like I said, just gonna repeat it again since why not? I don't want to miss information. So if the first condition evaluates to true, then the statements inside the first if statement are executed and the else if and else blocks are skipped. If the first condition evaluates to false and the second condition evaluates to true, then the first if statement and else block is not executed, but the second if statement is executed. If both if statements do not evaluate to true, then Java executes the statements inside of the else block. Examples of if, else if, else. So you can see here, I'm not going to go through it all, but you can see here how the differing outputs, since you can see how having the first one true and then the second one true and both of them false affect what output you have. Okay, notes for if, else blocks. So you can add as many else if blocks as you want. So you can have only 1, 0, or like 5. It doesn't really matter. You can have as many of them as you want. And you can only have one if statement and one else statement in this. So that also goes for if else blocks. So you can't have like 2 if statements and expect it to be connected with else if and else. So like I said, you can have like individual if statements, but if you wanted them to be connected with else if and else, for example, then you can only have one in that chain. Again, make sure to have good formatting, especially when you're starting to do else if and else. Else if blocks have to go in between the if and else block. In other bits of code, you can sometimes see that it doesn't really matter where code goes. But in this case, else if blocks have to go in between the if and else block. Since otherwise, Java won't recognize it as connected to the if and else block. So, and then it just think that you have only one else if block and nothing else, and that would cause an error. Right. You can't abbreviate it as elif. I know that I believe in Python, I believe it is. I think Python abbreviates it as elif, but in this case, you can't do that. So. Yeah, so like I said, there, you don't have to have an else block in this one. So you can just have if and else if, and then that'd be fine. Be careful. So like I said, you could have 2 single if statements, and on the left here, you see how you have 2 if statements and they both evaluate to true. So that ends up, it prints out AB instead of only A or only B like we want it to. So that's the thing with these types of things. You have to make sure that they're either like, if they're supposed to be connected, connect them. If they're not supposed to be connected, then don't connect them. That's the thing with this. So because there's a difference between them. So on the left, you can see how it prints out AB. And on the right here, you see how if it's connected, it only does one or the other. So in this case, it prints out A since the if statement evaluates true and not B. additional notes about if statements in general. Yeah, so make sure to use the correct type of if statement block, which was the example on the previous slide. The reason why you don't use multiple if statements in a row is because Java would execute each one of them if it values the true instead of skipping the ones we want skipped. And it is also possible to nest if statements, and I'll explain it on the next slide. And nesting just means placing something inside of another. And in this case, we're talking about if statements, but next week's class would be talking about loops, which is nesting loops. So talk about that next class. Also, if you create a variable inside of an if statement, you will not be able to use it outside of the if statement. The variable is called a local variable. And why that is because variables have a certain scope, which is a range. And in this case, the range only applies to the if statement. So that's why you can't use it outside of an if statement if you create one inside an if statement. Also, make sure your brackets always match each other. Never leave one bracket without its corresponding bracket, since now we're dealing with a lot of different brackets, and you need to keep track of them to make sure you don't come up with an error. Okay. Nesting example. So you can see here on the left how it stacks, it's inside of each other. And in this case, if you're formatting, you're gonna have to do a lot more formatting. All right, so pay close attention to the details of this. Notice that you have multiple nested if statements. You can also have many layers of nested if statements. So you can have if statements inside of if statements inside of if statements, and so on. If statements operate the same way they do in nested if statements as in regular if statements. And it is coding like this where you have to make sure you have good formatting. Otherwise, it'd be very hard to determine the output, for example. It might not affect your answer, but it might not affect your output, but it might affect somebody's ability to interpret the code. So in this example on the left, you can see that if it's true, then it tests the if statements inside the body of the statement. But notice that if the outer statement evaluates the false, then it skips over the entire thing and goes on to the next thing. And I believe that's it. Right, so that would be it for the lessons of this class then. But later we'll do class problems, so that'll be after. All right, so this is the problems, like I said. So basically just do the problems because they're good practice for future. And yeah, so basically just do the problems, practice, and if you have any questions, you can comment down below. And yeah, so just do the problems.